Jung's most forgotten discovery wasn't about mental illness or psychological disorders. It was about outcasts and why society systematically fears, rejects, and destroys individuals who refuse to conform to collective unconscious agreements. In his clinical practice, Jung documented individuals with what he called natural outsider syndrome, people who possessed an innate inability to participate in groupthink, social pretense, and collective self-deception that kept communities functioning smoothly. These outcasts could see through social facades instantly, refuse to participate in collective projections and blame, and maintain their individual authenticity even when it cost them social acceptance and belonging. But Jung discovered something terrifying. Society's fear of these outcasts wasn't random prejudice. It was systematic psychological defense against individuals who threatened the unconscious agreements that held civilization together. Jung called this discovery forgotten because modern psychology had misunderstood outcasts as maladjusted individuals who needed to be fixed or integrated into society, when actually they represented the most psychologically advanced members of human civilization. Their refusal to conform wasn't pathology. It was psychological evolution that threatened collective unconscious systems by refusing to participate in the shared delusions, projections, and denial mechanisms that most people required for emotional stability. Not because outcasts were superior beings, but because their individual authenticity made them natural enemies of any system that depended on unconscious conformity and collective psychological defense for its survival. Today, I'll reveal Jung's forgotten warning about why society fears outcasts, and why he believed this fear either leads to the systematic destruction of humanity's most evolved individuals or forces civilization to develop the consciousness that transforms outcasts from threats into evolutionary guides. Before we continue exploring this revolutionary discovery, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our deep psychology content. Leave your like to support the work and comment. Which aspect of this topic resonates most with you? Now let's dive into the discovery that changed everything. The case that revealed Jung's forgotten warning began with a patient he described in his private notes as the man who could not pretend. This patient came to Jung in 1922 during his intensive study of what he called individuation versus collective adaptation conflicts. He was a highly intelligent individual who had spent his entire life being rejected by groups, communities, and social institutions despite possessing exceptional moral character, creative abilities, and genuine concern for others' well-being. But Jung quickly realized he wasn't treating someone with social skills deficits or personality disorders. He was observing something far more profound and evolutionarily significant. Jung wrote, "The patient presents with what can only be described as constitutional inability to participate in collective unconscious agreements. He cannot pretend to beliefs he doesn't hold, cannot participate in group projections of blame and judgment, and cannot maintain social personas that contradict his authentic inner experience." This patient would consistently be excluded from social groups, not because he was cruel, selfish, or antisocial, but because his psychological authenticity made others uncomfortable with their own pretenses and unconscious behaviors. He would refuse to participate in gossip because he could see it was shadow projection, decline to join in collective judgments because he recognized his own capacity for the behaviors being condemned, and maintain consistent authenticity that made others feel exposed and defensive about their own social masks. Jung observed that wherever this patient went, workplaces, social groups, religious communities, even family gatherings, his presence would create subtle but pervasive discomfort that eventually led to his systematic exclusion or rejection. People couldn't articulate exactly why they found him disturbing, but they consistently felt uneasy around his unwillingness to participate in the unconscious games that held their groups together. Jung wrote, "The patient's authentic presence serves as a mirror that reflects others' unconscious behaviors and pretenses back to them, creating psychological discomfort that groups resolve by rejecting the mirror rather than examining what it reflects." His exclusion is not random social rejection, but systematic defense against consciousness that threatens collective unconscious stability. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about this pattern. Because this patient's authenticity was threatening to collective unconscious agreements, groups would unconsciously conspire to pathologize, marginalize, and destroy his credibility and social standing. They would create narratives about his supposed character defects, spread subtle rumors about his mental stability, and systematically undermine his reputation to eliminate the threat he posed to their collective psychological defense systems. Jung realized he was witnessing what he would later term collective shadow projection onto the outsider, a phenomenon where groups unconsciously attacked individuals who refused to participate in shared unconscious agreements because these individuals represented everything the group had collectively repressed or denied about themselves. Jung wrote in his personal observations, "Society systematically destroys its most psychologically evolved members, not through conscious malice, but through unconscious defense against the consciousness these individuals represent." The outcast becomes the repository for all the authenticity, individual responsibility, and psychological honesty that the collective cannot tolerate in itself. Therefore, Jung began investigating what he would call the psychology of collective fear toward individual consciousness. He discovered that societies, institutions, and communities had developed sophisticated mechanisms for identifying and eliminating individuals who possessed too much psychological awareness and authenticity to participate in collective unconscious agreements. Jung wrote, "Every stable social system depends on shared unconscious agreements, collective projections of shadow onto designated enemies, group denial of uncomfortable truths, and social personas that hide authentic individual experience. The individual who cannot or will not participate in these agreements becomes an existential threat to the system's psychological stability." Modern research by Dr. Brené Brown on belonging and authenticity validates Jung's early observations about the conflict between individual authenticity and collective acceptance. Her studies show that maintaining authentic self-expression often conflicts with social belonging and group acceptance. But Jung identified something more specific and more dangerous: the systematic persecution of individuals whose consciousness had evolved beyond collective unconscious participation. Jung observed that outcasts who maintained their authenticity despite social rejection often developed what he called evolutionary consciousness, psychological awareness that transcended collective limitations and could serve human development, but was too threatening for current social systems to integrate. Jung wrote, "The authentic outcast represents what humanity could become if it developed beyond collective unconscious dependency. But current social systems require unconscious conformity for stability, making these evolutionary individuals appear as threats rather than guides to collective development." Jung identified 4 distinct types of outcasts that society systematically fears and rejects. Type 1. The projection immune. Jung documented individuals who had developed such complete self-awareness that they could no longer participate in collective shadow projection, the psychological mechanism through which groups maintained cohesion by projecting their disowned qualities onto designated enemies or scapegoats. Jung wrote, "The projection immune individual has integrated their shadow contents so completely that they cannot participate in the collective psychological comfort of blaming others for qualities they recognize in themselves. This makes them dangerous to groups that depend on shared projection for emotional regulation and social bonding. These individuals would refuse to join in collective hatred of designated enemy groups because they could see the same potential in themselves, decline to participate in moral superiority over others because they had owned their own capacity for the condemned behaviors, and remain unmoved by propaganda designed to create group solidarity through shared opposition. Most disturbingly to groups, they would often show understanding and compassion for the very people the group needed to hate and blame, making them appear traitorous or psychologically disturbed to those who depended on collective projection. U for emotional stability. Type 2, the persona refuser. Jung identified outcasts who maintained such consistent authenticity that they could not maintain the social masks and false personas that normal social interaction required for smooth functioning. Jung wrote, "The persona refuser cannot adapt their personality to different social contexts, cannot pretend emotions they don't feel, and cannot maintain social facades that contradict their inner experience. This authenticity makes social interaction uncomfortable for others who depend on mutual pretense for psychological comfort." Jishi. These individuals would express genuine thoughts and feelings rather than socially appropriate responses, maintain consistent personality across all social contexts rather than adapting to group expectations, and refuse to participate in social rituals or conversations that felt inauthentic or meaningless to them. While this authenticity was psychologically healthy for the individual, it made others feel exposed and uncomfortable about their own social pretenses, leading to systematic exclusion from groups that required shared persona maintenance for cohesion. Type 3, the truth teller. Jung documented outcasts who possessed such clear perception that they consistently recognized and spoke about truths that groups needed to keep unconscious for their emotional stability and social functioning. Jung wrote, "The truth teller sees through collective self-deceptions, recognizes uncomfortable realities that groups prefer to ignore, and speaks about patterns and dynamics that threaten the psychological comfort of shared denial and wishful thinking." These individuals would point out obvious hypocrisies in group behavior, recognize and mention uncomfortable truths about group dynamics or individual behaviors, and refuse to participate in collective denial about problems or issues that needed to be addressed. Their truth-telling wasn't meant to be cruel or disruptive, but it consistently made groups uncomfortable by bringing unconscious contents into conscious awareness before the group was psychologically ready to integrate these insights. Type 4, the individual sovereignty maintainer. Jung identified the most threatening category of outcasts, individuals who maintained such complete psychological independence that they could not be controlled, manipulated, or coerced through normal social pressure and emotional manipulation. Jung wrote, "The individual sovereignty maintainer cannot be manipulated through guilt, controlled through fear, or coerced through social pressure. Their psychological independence makes them immune to the influence mechanisms that groups use to maintain conformity and collective behavior. These individuals would make decisions based on their own authentic values rather than social pressure, maintain their psychological autonomy even when faced with rejection or punishment, and resist attempts to manipulate them through collective emotion or group dynamics. Their independence was so complete that they represented proof that alternative ways of living and thinking were possible, threatening the collective belief that conformity and group participation were necessary for psychological stability and social belonging." Understanding your specific outcast type is crucial, because each creates different challenges for what Jung called authentic living in unconscious societies. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this warning so important and forgotten. Because Jung observed the devastating consequences of society's systematic persecution of its most conscious members, therefore he concluded that collective fear of authentic individuals posed genuine threats to human psychological and spiritual evolution. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this warning so critical. Danger 1. The elimination of evolutionary consciousness from human civilization. Jung wrote, "When societies systematically destroy their most psychologically aware members, they eliminate the very individuals who could guide collective development beyond current limitations of unconscious conformity and collective psychological defense." When authentic individuals were consistently rejected, marginalized, or destroyed by social systems, humanity lost access to the consciousness and insights these individuals could have contributed to collective development and evolutionary advancement. Jung observed that societies that successfully eliminated their conscious outcasts became psychologically stagnant, trapped in cycles of collective unconscious behavior that prevented adaptation, growth, and development beyond current limitations. This elimination of evolutionary consciousness created civilizations populated entirely by individuals whose psychological development had been arrested at the level of collective unconscious participation, making advancement beyond current social and psychological limitations impossible. Danger 2. The creation of consciousness-phobic social systems. Jung documented how societies that feared authentic individuals developed sophisticated mechanisms for identifying and eliminating psychological awareness before it could threaten collective unconscious stability. Jung wrote, "Social systems that systematically reject authentic individuals become increasingly hostile to consciousness itself, creating environments where psychological awareness and individual authenticity are treated as mental illness, social dysfunction, or moral failure." These consciousness-phobic societies would develop cultural norms, institutional structures, and social rewards that discouraged individual thinking, authentic self-expression, and psychological independence, while rewarding conformity, collective participation, and unconscious behavior. Over time, these systems would become so hostile to consciousness that even moderate levels of authenticity and individual awareness would be sufficient to trigger social rejection and systematic persecution. Danger 3. The perpetual unconsciousness trap. Most dangerously, Jung found that societies without authentic outcasts became trapped in perpetual unconsciousness because there were no individuals present who could challenge collective delusions, point out group shadow projections, or model alternative ways of living and thinking. Jung wrote, "Without authentic individuals to serve as mirrors and guides, societies become trapped in collective unconscious patterns that become increasingly rigid and destructive over time. They lose the capacity for self-reflection, growth, and adaptation that conscious individuals could provide. These unconscious societies would become increasingly dogmatic, defensive, and rigid because there were no voices present to challenge their collective assumptions, point out their shadow behaviors, or suggest alternative approaches to persistent problems. The absence of conscious outsiders created echo chambers where collective delusions became stronger over time, making adaptation to changing circumstances and psychological development beyond current limitations virtually impossible. This is why Jung considered the protection of authentic outcasts not just socially important, but evolutionarily urgent, because collective persecution of conscious individuals posed such threats to human development and psychological evolution. Therefore, Jung developed what he called the conscious outsider survival method, a systematic approach to maintaining authenticity while navigating societies that feared individual consciousness. Phase 1. Recognition of collective fear without impersonal pathologization. Jung taught outcasts to first recognize that social rejection was systematic defense against their consciousness rather than evidence of personal deficiency or character failure that needed correction. Jung wrote, "The authentic individual must understand that their social difficulties stem from society's fear of consciousness rather than from personal inadequacy. Their rejection is evidence of psychological evolution, not psychological pathology." Technique. Jung instructed outcasts to examine the pattern of their social rejection, recognizing that their exclusion consistently occurred not because of cruelty or antisocial behavior, but because of their refusal to participate in collective, unconscious agreements that others found essential for psychological comfort. He emphasized that understanding the systemic nature of their rejection was crucial for maintaining psychological health and continuing individual development rather than attempting to conform to collective unconscious expectations. Phase 2. Strategic authenticity in hostile environments. Jung discovered that outcasts needed to develop sophisticated strategies for maintaining their consciousness and authenticity while protecting themselves from systematic persecution and social destruction. Jung wrote, "The conscious individual must learn to be strategically authentic, maintaining their psychological integrity while avoiding unnecessary martyrdom that eliminates their capacity to contribute to collective development." Jung instructed outcasts to develop what he called protective authenticity, maintaining their individual consciousness while being selective about when and how they expressed insights that threatened collective unconscious stability. He taught them to find others who could appreciate their authenticity, build relationships with individuals capable of consciousness development, and create communities where authentic expression was safe and valued. Phase 3. Evolutionary service through conscious example. The final phase involved what Jung called silent teaching, serving human development through embodying authentic consciousness rather than trying to force others to abandon their collective unconscious participation. Jung wrote, "The conscious outsider serves evolution not by preaching against unconscious conformity, but by demonstrating what human consciousness becomes when it develops beyond collective psychological dependency." This required developing what Jung called compassionate detachment, maintaining complete authenticity while understanding that others' unconscious behaviors were expressions of psychological development rather than moral failure, and that forced consciousness raising usually triggered defensive rejection rather than genuine development. Because Jung understood that outcast persecution either eliminated evolutionary consciousness from civilization or forced authentic individuals to develop survival wisdom, therefore he studied both successful and unsuccessful cases to understand what determined whether conscious outsiders thrived or were destroyed by collective fear. The case of consciousness elimination. Jung documented numerous individuals whose authenticity had made them such targets of systematic persecution that they either abandoned their consciousness to gain social acceptance or were completely destroyed by collective rejection. Jung wrote about patients who had been so thoroughly marginalized, pathologized, and attacked for their authenticity that they eventually broke under the psychological pressure and either conformed to collective expectations or developed genuine mental illness from the stress of constant social persecution. These cases represented what Jung saw as the tragic loss of evolutionary consciousness. Individuals whose psychological development could have served humanity's advancement, but who were eliminated by societies too unconscious to recognize their value. The case of evolutionary contribution. Jung extensively studied historical figures who had successfully maintained their authenticity while contributing to human development despite systematic social rejection and persecution. He was particularly influenced by individuals like Meister Eckhart, Giordano Bruno, and other conscious outsiders who had been rejected by their societies, but whose consciousness eventually contributed to collective human development and cultural advancement. Jung wrote, "These conscious individuals learned to serve human evolution through their authentic example while protecting themselves from complete destruction by unconscious social systems. Their outsider status became the foundation for evolutionary contribution." Jung noted that these successful outcasts had developed what he called strategic consciousness, maintaining complete authenticity while finding ways to contribute their insights without triggering the full defensive fury of collective unconscious systems. Jung's own outcast integration. Most significantly, Jung documented his own experience as a psychological outsider whose ideas and insights were rejected by mainstream psychology and society during his lifetime. Jung wrote, "I learned through painful experience that authentic psychological insight threatens established systems and institutions because it challenges the unconscious agreements on which these systems depend for stability and authority." Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his rejection by mainstream psychology was not evidence that his ideas were wrong, but evidence that they threatened collective, unconscious assumptions about human nature and psychological development. This realization allowed him to continue developing his insights while building alternative communities and relationships with individuals who could appreciate authentic psychological exploration. Because authentic outcasts often struggle to find others who can understand and support their consciousness development, therefore Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called consciousness communities, groups of individuals capable of appreciating authenticity without feeling threatened by it. Jung wrote in letters, "The conscious individual must seek community with others who have achieved sufficient psychological development to appreciate authenticity as gift rather than threat to their own psychological stability." Jung identified 3 essential types of relationships for conscious outcasts. Type 1. Fellow individuated persons. Jung wrote, "The conscious outsider recognizes another conscious outsider immediately. There is a quality of authenticity and individual development that creates instant recognition and profound relief from the isolation of living authentically in unconscious environments." These connections often happen through recognition of shared commitment to truth, authenticity, and individual development over social acceptance and collective approval. With fellow conscious individuals, outcasts can express complete authenticity without fear of triggering defensive reactions or collective unconscious rejection. Type 2. Development seekers. Jung observed that people actively engaged in their own psychological and spiritual development could often appreciate conscious outsiders without feeling threatened by their authenticity. They might not have achieved complete individual consciousness themselves, but they understood its value and could engage with authentic individuals as guides and examples rather than threats to their psychological stability. Type 3. Natural, rebels and creatives. Jung identified individuals who, while they might not possess complete psychological consciousness, had natural resistance to collective conformity and could appreciate others who maintained individual authenticity. The recognition process. Jung developed specific indicators for identifying consciousness-compatible relationships. They demonstrate genuine curiosity about individual development and authentic self-expression rather than demanding conformity to group expectations. They can tolerate uncertainty, complexity, and individual differences rather than requiring simple explanations and collective agreement about everything. They show interest in truth and authentic understanding rather than comfortable illusions and social pretense. Consciousness community protocol. Jung taught outcasts to assess relationship potential carefully. Do they become defensive when presented with authentic thoughts and feelings, or do they show genuine curiosity? Can they handle individual differences and authentic self-expression without trying to change or convert others to their perspective? Do they demonstrate their own commitment to growth and development rather than demanding that others conform to their expectations? Jung emphasized, the goal is not to find people who accept all authenticity uncritically, but to find people who can engage with consciousness development as valuable exploration rather than threat to their psychological stability. Because conscious authenticity serves both individual development and collective evolution when supported by psychologically aware communities. Therefore, Jung viewed the survival of authentic outcasts as essential not just for personal fulfillment, but for humanity's psychological and spiritual advancement. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, the conscious individual who maintains authenticity despite collective rejection serves as scout for human consciousness development, demonstrating what becomes possible when awareness develops beyond collective unconscious dependency. He believed that successful outcasts become what he called consciousness carriers, individuals who preserve and develop human psychological potential that collective systems are not yet ready to integrate. The 4 stages of outcast consciousness development. Stage 1, rejection recognition without conformity pressure. The first transformation occurs when outcasts learn to understand social rejection as systematic defense against consciousness, rather than evidence that they should abandon authenticity to gain acceptance. Jung called this outsider awareness, recognizing that rejection serves to protect collective unconscious stability rather than indicating personal deficiency. Jung wrote, the beginning of conscious outsider development is understanding that your social difficulties arise from others' fear of consciousness rather than from your own psychological inadequacy or social failure. Stage 2, strategic authenticity without authenticity compromise. The second stage involves learning to maintain complete psychological integrity while protecting yourself from systematic persecution and social destruction. Jung called this protective consciousness, being strategically selective about when and how to express authenticity while never compromising your inner truth or individual development. Jung observed, the conscious outsider learns not to hide their authenticity, but to express it wisely and selectively with individuals and communities capable of appreciating consciousness development. Stage 3, community building without conformity demand. The third transformation happens when outcasts learn to find and build relationships with others capable of supporting consciousness development while respecting individual differences and authentic self-expression. Jung called this consciousness community creation, building relationships and groups that support authenticity and individual development rather than demanding conformity and collective agreement. Jung wrote, the privilege of conscious outsider development is discovering others who appreciate authenticity and can engage in mutual consciousness development without requiring identical beliefs or perspectives. Stage 4, evolutionary service without preaching. The final stage involves what Jung called consciousness modeling, serving human development through authentic example rather than trying to convince others to abandon collective unconscious participation. Jung observed, the fully developed conscious outsider serves evolution not by demanding that others become authentic, but by demonstrating what human consciousness becomes when it develops beyond collective psychological dependency. The consciousness becomes evolutionary service. Jung believed that authentic outcasts who successfully maintain their consciousness serve a vital evolutionary function for human psychological and spiritual development. They preserve and develop awareness that collective systems cannot yet integrate, creating templates for consciousness development that will eventually serve broader human advancement. Jung wrote, "What is preserved in the conscious outsider today becomes available for collective integration tomorrow. They serve as repositories for human psychological potential that current social systems are not yet capable of supporting." But Jung warned about specific pitfalls that can derail conscious outsider development, because the path of maintaining authenticity in hostile environments contains specific dangers. Therefore, Jung documented the most common ways outcasts sabotage their own consciousness development. Pitfall 1. The superiority inflation trap. Jung wrote extensively about outcasts who became identified with their consciousness as evidence of superiority rather than recognizing it as evolutionary responsibility and service opportunity. In Psychology and Religion, he warned, the danger is that conscious authenticity becomes spiritual pride rather than evolutionary service, leading to arrogance that actually prevents consciousness development and authentic contribution. Outcasts who fell into this trap would become judgmental about others' unconscious behavior, superior about their own awareness level, and dismissive of people who hadn't achieved similar consciousness development. Pitfall 2. The martyrdom addiction. Jung documented cases where outcasts became addicted to their rejection and persecution, using their outsider status as identity rather than as foundation for consciousness development and evolutionary service. Jung wrote, "True consciousness development transcends both conformity and rebellion, seeking authentic expression rather than identity based on social acceptance or rejection." These individuals would seek out rejection and persecution to validate their outsider identity, becoming more invested in their marginalization than in their consciousness development or potential contribution to human advancement. Pitfall 3. The isolation justification. Jung observed that some outcasts would use their consciousness to justify complete withdrawal from human community, convincing themselves that others were too unconscious for relationship or authentic connection. They would become hermits who avoided all social engagement, using their awareness as excuse for non-participation in human community rather than as foundation for conscious engagement and evolutionary service. Jung warned, consciousness is meant to serve human development, not to justify escape from humanity. The conscious individual must remain engaged with collective development while maintaining authentic awareness. Pitfall 4. The conformity collapse. Even successfully conscious outcasts could regress into abandoning their authenticity during periods of extreme social pressure or when rejection became too psychologically costly to maintain. They would convince themselves that conformity was actually wisdom or maturity, abandoning their consciousness development to gain social acceptance and psychological relief from the stress of constant rejection. Jung emphasized, consciousness development requires ongoing commitment to authenticity regardless of social consequences, while maintaining strategic wisdom about expression and community building. The consciousness maintenance. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy outcast consciousness development. Regular assessment of whether social rejection stems from authentic consciousness or from unconscious antisocial behavior. Continued community building with others capable of appreciating and supporting consciousness development. Strategic evaluation of when and how to express authenticity based on others' capacity for consciousness without compromising inner truth. ongoing service activities that channel consciousness into practical contribution to human development and evolutionary advancement. Connection with other conscious individuals for mutual support and reality checking about consciousness development versus spiritual inflation. Jung wrote, "Conscious outsider development is not a permanent achievement, but an ongoing practice, requiring constant balance between authentic expression and strategic wisdom about consciousness sharing." Because Jung understood outcast persecution within the context of broader human consciousness evolution, therefore he viewed conscious outsiders as serving essential functions for humanity's psychological and spiritual advancement. In answer to Job, Jung wrote, "The conscious individual who maintains authenticity despite collective rejection serves as bridge between current human limitations and future consciousness potential, preserving awareness that will eventually serve broader, evolutionary development." He believed that authentic outcasts serve as what he called evolution scouts, individuals whose consciousness development provides templates and possibilities for collective human advancement beyond current psychological limitations. The historical pattern. Jung observed that throughout history, humanity's most significant consciousness developments had often been preserved and advanced by individuals who were rejected by their societies, but whose awareness eventually contributed to collective advancement. Jung wrote, "What appears in the conscious outsider first as individual awareness later manifests in collective development as expanded consciousness, improved psychological understanding, and advancement beyond previous limitations." Modern manifestations. Jung believed that in the modern era, conscious outcasts might be developing awareness about psychological integration beyond collective unconscious dependency, individual authenticity that transcends social conformity, pressure consciousness development that serves evolution rather than ego inflation, and spiritual awareness that contributes to collective advancement rather than personal superiority. Jung's insight. The conscious outsider feels the evolutionary pressure toward expanded awareness first and most intensely. Their individual development often demonstrates what entire societies will eventually need to achieve for continued psychological and spiritual advancement. The service without sacrifice. Jung's crucial insight was that consciousness serves human evolution best when it's maintained strategically rather than martyred dramatically. The goal isn't to be destroyed by collective fear of awareness, but to preserve and develop consciousness in service of eventual collective advancement. Jung wrote, "The conscious outsider serves humanity not by sacrificing their awareness to gain social acceptance or by being destroyed through conscious martyrdom, but by maintaining consciousness development that will eventually serve broader human evolutionary advancement." The ultimate consciousness. At the highest level of development, Jung observed that conscious outcasts learn to hold their awareness as evolutionary service rather than personal achievement, maintaining authenticity without superiority, preserving consciousness without isolation, and serving development without preaching about others' unconscious limitations. Jung called this evolutionary consciousness, the ability to serve human advancement through conscious authenticity that demonstrates what becomes possible when awareness develops beyond collective unconscious dependency. Remember Jung's patient from 1922, the man who could not pretend. After years of learning to navigate conscious authenticity in hostile environments, his life transformed completely. He learned to understand social rejection as defense against consciousness rather than evidence of personal failure. He found communities of individuals who could appreciate authenticity without feeling threatened by it. He developed strategic methods for maintaining consciousness while protecting himself from systematic persecution. Most importantly, he stopped viewing his outcast status as evidence of social inadequacy and began understanding it, as Jung called, evolutionary responsibility, to preserve consciousness development that serves human advancement beyond current collective limitations. Jung wrote about this transformation. The patient learned not to abandon his authenticity to gain social acceptance or to use his consciousness to justify complete isolation from humanity, but to maintain awareness as service to human development that will eventually benefit collective consciousness evolution. This represents Jung's forgotten warning about society's fear of outcasts, that collective unconscious systems systematically destroy their most conscious members to protect psychological stability, eliminating the very individuals who could guide evolutionary development beyond current limitations. And this persecution will either eliminate evolutionary consciousness from human civilization or force conscious individuals to develop exactly the wisdom that serves collective advancement. Authenticity that preserves awareness while navigating unconscious systems strategically. Your outcast status isn't evidence of personal failure or social inadequacy. It's systematic defense against your consciousness development that threatens collective unconscious agreements. You're not being rejected because you're deficient or antisocial. You're being excluded because your authenticity makes others uncomfortable with their own pretenses and unconscious behaviors. The question isn't whether you should abandon your consciousness to gain social acceptance. The question is whether you'll develop the strategic wisdom necessary to maintain authenticity while building communities that support consciousness development. Jung's conscious outsider survival method offers a path from persecuted isolation to evolutionary service, from rejected authenticity to strategic consciousness contribution, from social outcast to evolution scout. You were born to be conscious, not to conform unconsciously or be destroyed by collective fear, but to serve human development through authenticity that demonstrates what consciousness becomes when it develops beyond collective psychological dependency. The world needs your authentic consciousness, but it needs it preserved and developed strategically in service of eventual collective advancement rather than sacrificed to unconscious systems or used to justify isolation from human community. Your outcast status is not your failure. Your failure to recognize your consciousness as evolutionary service is your missed opportunity. Learn to maintain awareness strategically, and you become exactly what Jung believed conscious outsiders were meant to be: scouts for human consciousness evolution who preserve awareness that will eventually serve collective advancement beyond current limitations. Jung's forgotten warning about society's fear of outcasts wasn't that conscious individuals get rejected. It's that most outcasts never understand their rejection as systematic defense against consciousness, remaining trapped in self-blame or superiority rather than recognizing their evolutionary responsibility. The forgotten truth isn't in experiencing social rejection. It's in failing to develop the strategic consciousness that transforms outcast status into evolutionary service for human development. You are not too different or authentic for human society. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Once you learn to maintain awareness as strategically as Jung learned to preserve his psychological insights, if you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the authentic outcast who faces systematic rejection, you're part of a conscious group that human evolution depends on for awareness preservation and consciousness development. Share in the comments what outcast experiences you've had. Your consciousness journey connects with others, learning to transform rejection into evolutionary service. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about consciousness development that transcends collective unconscious limitations. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about individual authenticity in unconscious systems, check out my video on Jung's most dangerous discovery about individuation, where I reveal the specific methods for maintaining consciousness development while navigating societies that fear psychological awareness and authentic self-expression. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.